Hello and welcome to today's Audio Train Skills webinar, brought to you by Audio UK with the support of the members. Today we're talking about how to make complex audio recordings with Ian Betson from AV Resilience. So, hi Ian, tell me a bit about your technical background.
My background, Caroline, is I'm ex-BBC. I joined it on the 18th of January 1988 in radio. I worked in network radio for a couple of years and Maida Vale and Radio Outside Broadcast Department. I then did 5 years as a local radio engineer, one of the BBC's local stations, and my last 2 years of BBC employment was a technical training instructor for BBC News. I then went out into the commercial sector, stayed as an engineer building studios, but also doing operational work to make a living. And a lot of what I will talk about this afternoon is based on my experiences from my freelance work, and also learned when I was in BBC Local, where we had to turn our hand to a variety of programming skills more than when I was originally trained.
So loads of different experiences here, I'm sure, which you'll be sharing with us. Ian's going to do a bit of chat and then time for you to ask questions if you want to. So please, if you do, use the question and answer tag on the Zoom. So earlier in the year, you talked to us about remote recordings, which was very topical, obviously, at the beginning of lockdown. Now you're moving on to complex recordings. Do you think people are now being asked to do more complex recordings now that we're further into the sort of more unusual circumstances that we find ourselves in at the moment?
Well, on the back end of last year and into the first 2-3 months of this year, prior to March and the lockdown, I was both supplying a lot of equipment to podcast producers who were expected to do 4-person recordings and needed the equipment to do that. I was also getting inquiries from established podcasters and audio content producers who were expected to, who wanted to, part of this year, to take their podcast on the road. They wanted to record in front of live audiences. They wanted to live stream it. They wanted audience reaction. Now, unfortunately, all those things got put on ice. But then it evolved in terms of, yes, I did the earlier webinar on remote guests and getting the best quality you can there. And I think some producers are kind of sort of held back from that in 2019 as sort of unknown territory. Come lockdown, they had to do it. And therefore, they discovered that perhaps it wasn't as complicated as it might have been. Now we're starting to find their feet again. I've noticed some of the panel discussions on BBC Radio, and I imagine podcasters are probably doing the same, that they are getting their guests back, not necessarily in the studio and not necessarily remotely, but they're in a room and they're socially distanced, perhaps with screens, and they're bringing in guests remotely, whereas they wouldn't have before. Doing simple recordings with 4 people into a mixer and recorder is one thing, but when you start adding a remote element of guests coming in, you've got other technical factors to consider. So yes, the level of complexity of podcasts has increased. We've also got other options such as the Audio Content Fund. Last year, I was working with a couple of independent production companies who have been awarded, or the radio stations have been awarded money to make programming that was perhaps more complicated than simple disk-link programming, and therefore there's those opportunities and there's those requirements that for technical complex programs. So yeah, I think it has, though I would say at the moment we're a little bit unknown in a state of flux. Next year we'll have to see what happens, but it's going to happen eventually when we'll go back to a sort of state of normality, whatever that might be, and we're going to be expected to produce content like this that will require a certain level of technical installation.
Okay, Ian, well, take it away. Do go ahead with the presentation.
Thank you very much, Caroline. We've got a simple diagram here of 4 channels of microphones into a mixer, a multi-channel recorder, or indeed a separate recorder, and a couple of headphones, one for a producer and one for an engineer. This was the kind of thing that I was asked to do were asked to supply last year by some producers, and that's fine. That is something that is probably one step up from the normal 1-to-1 or 1-to-2 interviews, but they are by definition probably being recorded outside the studio. They are going to be perhaps in people's homes or in offices, so you're out and into effectively an outside broadcast environment, and that brings the other aspects that we have to consider in this webinar this afternoon, such as logistics, health and safety, and other things that are outside your control. If we move on, I mentioned the fact that we might have remote guests now being brought into a panel discussion. The technical complexity jumps up a level. It is not just a case of bringing that guest in by a piece of software, perhaps IPDTL, which is one particular piece, or software, or Clean Feed, or even Skype, just running it on a separate laptop or Mac and bringing that in. You will notice on the left-hand side, I'm bringing my remote guest into the mixer, into the mixer on a fader, but I'm also having to supply a Q feed, a return feed back to that remote guest so they can hear what's going on. But jumping over to the other side, we now have 4 sets of headphones for our studio guests. The reason being they have to wear headphones, of course, is that the incoming audio from the remote guests has to be heard by those studio guests. Well, you can't rely on a speaker on the Mac or on the laptop, because that is going to be picked up by the 4 microphones from the panel discussion. So those people have to hear the audio, and the only way to do that properly and artistically pleasing and a good audio mix is to use headphones. So obviously we now have to supply 4 sets of headphones for those the guests. So instantly the level of complexity jumps up and the amount of kit you need. Let's jump up another stage, and I'm going to use this example as all through this webinar, that this is a technical rig that has a mixer. We've got some radio mics thrown in. We've got audience participation. We've got some musical inserts. We've got some musicians. We've got a variety of content being recorded, and it either has to be heard by various people, or indeed we might be streaming it or linking it out to a broadcast studio. What I must say is that all the equipment here I class as what I call a carry-in recording. It's all bagged up. It can go in a small van. It can go in the back of an estate car. I'm not mentioning recording trucks. I'm not mentioning large lorries. All these scenarios are aimed at producers who would be expected to produce this kind of content using this level of equipment. I'm not going to be covering what the equipment you would use to cover a music festival, for instance, although you could use this equipment to cover a sub sort of event at that festival and link it back to your radio station, or link it or record it for a future podcast. You can see here technical level of complexity has gone up a bit. Yes, in the middle, a salient item, we have the mixer. Top left, we have 4 channels of radio mics. This will allow our presenters, and indeed if we're using roving mics around the audience, to roam freely. In the middle, a laptop. This is the device, in this instance, we're just using to play off our local audio inserts as part of the recording. And we've got some musicians here. This is actually a diagram that I produced for an actual recording a couple of years ago, and I just made it nice and pretty for this webinar. And we have a piano, cello, and an effects mic. Again, I'll be talking about that so we can get the audience reaction nicely. A couple of pairs of headphones for our producer and our engineer on the right-hand side. We need a PA, so the PA speaker system, so we can hear our inserts. That is obviously in argument, really, to the quality of the recording we want to get through the microphones. So I've used a separate mixer there to control the levels and make sure that we don't get into any feedback, or the PA is arguing with the recording. Moving into the lower middle, where it says main, that's the main output of the mixer. It goes into a box marked DA. That's a distribution amplifier. It's a fancy word, really, for an audio splitter. You put two stereo signal in one end, and there's a row of connectors at the other end, and it splits it out into 4 or 5 stereo feeds. That's all it does. And that allows me to drive the various other boxes down below, such as the PPM and the recorder. I've gone, and really the best practice is not to daisy chain things together with loads of Y leads and splitters, because the problem is if you get a failure or interaction of one piece of equipment, it's going to affect everything that's split off via all those splitters. A distribution amplifier is really the professional and proper way to do it. If, say, the recorder goes faulty, it won't affect the meters, or as you can see there, it won't affect my ISDN unit, as we were using in this case to link the signal back to the radio station. So the distribution amplifier is driving all those areas. The PPM, my peak program meter, I'm BBC, as I said, so I love my PPMs to see what levels I'm monitoring with, so I had a separate unit there. A local recorder. Again, even if you're streaming this material or sending it back to a radio station for broadcast, I strongly urge you have a local recording just in case, or it might even be a higher quality recording. We all know the vagaries of internet links sometimes. And then, as you can see, the ISDN unit we used in this case back to the station. One particular area that does raise a technical complexity, especially if you've got audiences and you've got presenters moving around, and you've got a producer as well, those two parties obviously need to talk to each other. So we've got a talkback system here that allows the producer to communicate with the in-ear monitoring transmitter system to the in-ear monitors at the bottom, which both the presenters had and the two people with roving mics had. So they could be in communication with the producer. It's a one-way system, but it's good enough that the producer can issue instructions to those people. So that lot was a technical rig that I created, and it turned into this, which was the actual rig at the broadcast. There is no way I could remember how all this lot would plug up when I planned the outside broadcast. So that's why you produce the nice diagram. It also allows you to, if there's any issues, to fault find quickly, because there's nothing worse than having an audience breathing down your neck, or the producer breathing down your neck as you're trying to find out why one particular mic doesn't work. Let's moving on then. So the aims we're going to do of this webinar. I'm going to go from 4 mics, say, into an H6, a Zoom H6 recorder, to an audience rig that requires a PA, effects mics, musical inserts. And those applications might be, as I mentioned earlier, podcasts, radio, and the medium for medium to smaller events, not your Glastonburys or your proms. We have to consider overriding all of this the health and safety aspects, and they will obviously be highlighted by things such as the site recce, the rigging and the production aspects, how you're going to rig all this equipment and what the production actually requires, and your external influences. And by those, I class that as anything from the venue management to the weather to the traffic that you might have going to and from the venue. And the outcomes. What I'm aiming this webinar at is in allowing you as a producer to stage smaller events yourself, your 4 microphones and your guest remotely, through to the larger events that I've just covered there with their musical inserts and their audience reaction. Either yourself, or if you don't have the equipment, be able to speak authoritatively to a services company such as myself to say, this is what we want. And also to speak authoritatively to the venue manager about what you want as well. So let's stick with the PowerPoint. Planning, that's the first thing we need to consider. And I'll illustrate a couple of rigs I've done here. That was the original venue that nice diagram came out of. You can see in the back there, they were the access doors. Notice the 2 blue dots in the middle of it. They are a fire escape. We used an ISDN line, which was through that door. We had to bring the cable in there. You have to consider those cable access issues when you are doing your site recce. We can't jam the doors open. It's a fire escape. So how are we going to overcome that? In concert with the producer, or maybe you are the producer yourself and you know exactly what you want, where is your performance area? where is the main action going to take place? In my case, this was where the piano was. That kind of dictated where everything was going. That's where it would be. And the audience were obviously on the opposite side of this circular central area. Where is the technical area going to be? Where are we going to set up that equipment? Well, one of the things to consider is, where am I getting my power from? How much space do I have? What are the sight lines like to the performance area? Those kind of things you have to consider. Where will the public come in or go out, or where will the artists come in and out of? And again, also with a view to the logistical aspect of just bringing the equipment in, taking the equipment out, and the cable runs. So, as I said, from that site recce, I produced this diagram. As you can see, the kit came in through those fire escapes. The front entrance at the bottom right, the bottom left, was where the audience came in, and we were actually behind the audience as well, as they were in two areas, and our technical equipment and the production team sat down on the bottom left-hand side. Don't produce something as beautiful as this, as Quick Sketch will do, but it keeps it clear in your mind. Now, from that, and in concert with the producer and the requirements, we can produce our kit list from that we require. And one of those areas, of course, is where our cable run is going to be, and what are the other logistics. This is the if you know it, this is the main event area at the world famous Salford Lads Club in Salford, the one that was made famous by the Smiths. I'm highlighting this because this is quite interesting. I was asked to do the site recce, but I didn't actually do the broadcast. I wasn't available for it. Now, of course, if you're doing a site recce and you don't pick things up, but you're doing the broadcast, frankly, that's your problems. You've got to deal with it. But of course, in this case, if I miss things and hand it over to someone who's expected to deliver the broadcast, they might not thank me if I've missed some salient things like, well, you didn't tell me they were digging the road up outside the building, and there's lots of jackhammers going on, and I had to walk 100 meters lugging all the equipment in because I couldn't park outside. This particular room, the stage dictated the performance area, and you'll notice there's a couple of small light dots there. That was the power, so we could pick our PA system up there. PA was going to be used, it was a discussion program with some local Manchester bands were being interviewed, and also some music. So the PA was being used both for sound reinforcement, but also as give the sound a bit of some beans with the musicians who were playing. Where this photograph was taken was from a balcony, and the obvious place there was where the equipment was to be set up. We had good sight lines, and we could see down to the performance area. In the main area, the audience was going to be seated. There was about 300 people present at this event with a central aisle. It doesn't take long to fill a venue up with 100 people, and there was going to be some audience reaction. Now, roving mics. If you're going to have an audience that size and you have one roving mic, I guarantee to you that can slow the proceedings down. Always have at least 2 roving mics when you're covering an audience of anything more than 50 people. It means it gives your rovers time to move around while one guest or one member of the audience is speaking, and the other roving mic can be in a position under the direction of the producer. That's why we need the in-ear monitoring system and the talkback to line the other guest up. There's nothing worse than the poor presenter having to almost do a running commentary, really, saying, oh, we're just waiting for the mic to get to the audience member. What do you want to say, sir? And then there's this great pause as the poor gentleman's initially sort of caught with a rabbit in his headlights and has to compose himself before speaking. Having 2 roving mics just speeds things up and makes for an easier recording and just an easier edit, probably, in taking all the slight gaps out. Cable runs. A good example here, we can see we've got 2 doors on either side of the stage. The right-hand side one was where the audience were going to come in and out of. Some stairs you can see there. But notice the signs above them. They're both fire escapes. The obvious way to bring the cabling in then was on the left-hand side of the picture, but even with radio mic equipment, you've still got quite a lot of cabling with the PA, and there were some fixed microphones on stands going to the stage. Quite a lot of cabling going between the technical area and the stage. So you don't really want to have that lying on the floor, and you cannot tape it on the floor, even if it's further enough away from that door, from that fire escape on the left-hand side. So the obvious place to route it is over the top of the door. So in this case, we brought the cabling just below the windows at about sort of head height over that door and onto the stage. These are the kind of things that you need to consider when you're rigging. The other thing to consider on a health and safety aspect, we're up on the balcony here. We're dropping the cabling down so it can work its way around over the balcony and under the windows. You've got other considerations to take into account there, that you could be classed as working from heights. I would suggest you do not do that and bring a ladder and try and rig it that way. Do everything you possibly can from floor level. So in that case, we drop the cable over the balcony to somebody else on the ground, and then bring the cable round and securely route it under the windows. This particular recording was also being broadcast live, and in this case we used a radio links vehicle to get the signal back. This is where planning comes in, and an end-to-end approach. And I always like to say, start from the beginning. Where are we parking the vehicle? I looked out the window. This was behind the balcony area, and there's 2 parking spaces there. Are those parking spaces the venues? I asked. Yes, they were. Could you reserve them on the night of the broadcast? Because we've got 2 vehicles turning up, the links vehicle and just a car with the production people. Yes, they would do that. That's fine. Great. Ticked off. Nothing worse than that turning up and you can't park near the venue. The window there, we had to link to the links vehicle via a thin cable. It was just a Cat5 data cable, quite thin. It still had to leave the building. Take it out the window, that's fine. Health and safety was okay, we could secure it, and that's fine. But security, both environmental and just, perhaps we say ne'er-do-wells around the area, could we leave that window like that? Is that okay? Were the venue happy with it? It could have thunderstormed with rain on that evening, and we could have ended up flooding the building. So it's those kind of areas I'm thinking of the keeping the client and keeping the venue happy. That picture was purely taken just so when I did the site recce, I could hand that over to people and saying, that's the cable route, and down there you'll find 2 parking spaces that will be reserved for you. Get the details of all the site manager or the site officers, and get all their phone numbers and emails. You can confirm that these facts with them. We'll be turning up tomorrow. We'll be turning up next week with to do the recording. Is it okay for those 2 parking spaces that we spoke about?